The Sicilian defense begins with pawn to e4, pawn to c5. If you are playing as white and prefer to avoid the deeply complex main lines of the Sicilian defense, a great alternative is the Alapin variation. This approach is not only easier to understand, but also carries an element of surprise with its aggressive and tactical possibilities. Your initial idea is to play pawn to d4, aiming to establish a strong central pawn structure. Another advantage of the Alapin variation of the Sicilian defense is that, in most cases, your opponent will respond with knight to c6, which is a standard move in the Sicilian defense in general, but against the Alapin variation of the Sicilian defense, it allows white. This move is actually a mistake. You proceed with pawn to d4 as planned, strengthening your central control and putting pressure on your opponent's pawn on c5. Additionally, your pawn on e4 is ready to advance, potentially forcing the opponent's knight on c6 to retreat. In most cases, your opponent will exchange pawns, but they still have to deal with the threat of your pawn on d4 advancing and attacking their knight on c6. This is why bringing out the knight to c6 so early was not the best choice. At this point, they must find a solution. Typically, they will play pawn to d5 themselves. If they do not, you can push your pawn to e5, forcing their knight on f6 to retreat and securing more space in the center, which is beneficial for you. If they choose to play pawn to d5, it leads to a sharp variation where you should respond with knight to c3. Once again, you catch your opponent off guard. They likely expected a simple exchange, but instead, you increase the pressure, forcing them to react. The pawn on d5 is now under attack twice, leaving your opponent with an important decision to make. In most situations, they will opt for the most straightforward solution, capturing your pawn on e4. Shortly, I will explain how to proceed if they decide to defend the pawn on d5, but in the majority of cases, they will take the pawn on e4, expecting you to immediately recapture. However, instead of recapturing, you introduce yet another surprise by pushing pawn to d5 anyway. This move frees your pawn to advance, allowing you to gain more space while also improving your development by forcing the opponent's knight on c6 to move. Now the key question is, where can the knight on c6 go? It cannot move to the center of the board because your queen controls that square, limiting its options and making your position even stronger. That move is also incorrect because after queen to a4, you create a double attack, forcing your opponent to lose their knight. Retreating the knight to its original starting position feels too passive for black, so most opponents will instead play knight to e5. At this point, they expect you to finally recapture the pawn on e4, but instead, you play a more cunning move, queen to a forecheck. Once they block the check, you recapture the pawn on e4 with your queen, attacking the knight on e5 once again, and gaining another tempo for your development. Now, your opponent must decide what to do with the knight on e5. Attempting to defend it with pawn to f6 is awkward because it locks the knight on g8, restricting their position while also weakening their king's safety. Therefore, they will likely move the knight on g6 elsewhere. In this position, you can simply continue your development and use your space advantage to secure a very comfortable position. However, you can also choose to play knight to b5, a subtle but effective trick that works well for white in this position. The idea is that many opponents will either play a knight to f6, attempting to gain a tempo by attacking your queen, or try to eliminate the troublesome knight on b5 by playing pawn to a6. Regardless of their choice, they risk falling into a spectacular checkmate with knight to d6. But this is not just a cheap trick. Even if your opponent notices the threat, stopping it is not straightforward. If they attempt to trade off your knight on b5, it turns out to be a serious blunder. Their king is suddenly in check, and the only piece that can block the attack is their queen. However, this allows you to capture the queen, winning the game instantly. Another tempting move for black is queen to a 5 check, as it appears to be a double attack, but white still has strong responses to maintain the advantage. But in reality, this is not a real threat. You simply block the check, attacking their queen, and your knight on b5 remains safely defended. This means they cannot capture it, forcing them to move their queen away, making the check completely useless and a waste of time. Moreover, they not only need to control this critical square, but they also have to guard another key square, as you are preparing to fork their king and rook from there. To prevent this, they will often play queen to b6. However, you continue attacking their queen, trying to push it away from both important squares. After a few more checks, your plan is complete. Their queen is forced to move, and no matter where it goes, the outcome remains the same. You gain a decisive advantage. In a similar game, black chose pawn to e6 instead of capturing the pawn on d5. The idea behind pawn to e6 was to reinforce control over the central pawn on d5, but this still allowed white to continue with strong attacking play. You push your central pawn to gain a space advantage, creating a structure similar to the French defense advance variation. However, this position is even better for white since you don't have a pawn on c3, allowing for easier development of your knight to a more comfortable square. In the main line, black typically develops their kingside pieces, bringing out the bishop, then the knight, and finally castling. However, this classical approach leads to a quick loss after bishop takes h7, a brilliant sacrifice. Now, the king is forced to move, and knight to g5 delivers a check, leading to a decisive attack. If the king retreats to g8, then queen to h5, followed by queen to h7, delivers a standard checkmating pattern, winning the game for white. If the king moves forward, it must avoid the diagonal controlled by your bishop. If it tries to hide, it remains highly vulnerable. You can push pawn to h5 or play queen to d3 check, both leading to a swift victory. After pawn to h5, if the king moves, you can play knight to f7, delivering a double check while also attacking their queen. Once the king moves, you capture the queen on d8, forcing resignation. Now, what if your opponent chooses a different approach and develops their knight to c6 instead? If black plays passively with moves like pawn to d6 or pawn to g6, it doesn't change much. You simply play pawn to d4, establish a strong central pawn chain, develop comfortably, and enjoy a slight space advantage without needing any special preparation. In a game between two grandmasters, black played knight to f6, a move rarely seen at the amateur level. It attacks the pawn on e4, but the downside is that white can push forward and challenge the knight. However, since the knight remains in the center, it is still a playable option for black. Despite this, white continued with pawn to d4, and after an exchange, black played pawn to d6, aiming to open the diagonal for their bishop. White played bishop to c4, gaining a tempo, and after knight to b6, continued with bishop to b5 check. After bishop to d7, instead of capturing, white played the surprising pawn to e6. The bishop can't take it due to the pin, and if black captures on b5, white strikes with queen to h5, delivering a deadly double attack. With the pawn on f7 pinned and under attack, plus targeting the bishop on b5, black is in an uncomfortable spot. Instead of defending, black captured on e6, and white retreated the bishop to d3, creating another threat. If black carelessly plays knight to c6, white can deliver queen to h5 check, forcing a weak defense. Then, sacrificing the queen leads to a spectacular checkmate. Seeing the danger, black played pawn to g6, but white continued with pawn to h4, aiming for h5, keeping up the attack and making defense difficult. Black plays knight c6. White played pawn to h5, attacking, and black couldn't capture due to a checkmate threat. Instead, black played rook to g8 for defense. After a trade, white unleashed a brilliant rook to h8 sacrifice. If the rook moves, bishop takes g6 is checkmate. Sensing danger, black played king to f7, but white continued with a queen check, forcing the king to move again. Then came another stunning sacrifice. Rook to h7. With no choice but to accept, white followed up with queen to h5, securing the win. Black resigned as the pawn on g6 was pinned, and checkmate was inevitable. Despite playing logical moves, black was completely overwhelmed. If you found this video helpful, then like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.